Hi, I'm Nikon Ambassador Vincent Versace, and welcome to my first series of 2-minute tutorials. In this series, there are 14 of them. There is something I would like to point out, however. Gianni J. Cat, my cat, decided that what he wanted to be was the sound engineer because he's convinced that he has a God-given right to play with any dangling cable. So when we were shooting the pickups for 5, 10 and 11 and we're shooting all of 7, the microphone cable was not as connected as I would like it to have been, and so there is a little uniqueness to the audio. Aside from that, have fun. Hi, I'm Nikon Ambassador Vincent Versace, and I'm here to talk to you about the wonderful world of blur, when blur is the focus. Now, the reason why I feel comfortable speaking about blur at the level in which I'm going to speak to you about is that, well, quite frankly, I am the world's foremost expert on photographing snot-encrusted children, fog, and blur. And my qualifications to make this statement are pretty clear. I've spent most of my life in either a fog or a blur, so I've got a pretty good understanding of what it means to see the blur. Now, all kidding aside, I think blur is probably the most important part of a photograph that gets overlooked, and one of the most important aspects compositionally to consider about your imagery. So let's start with the biggest, the grandest, the largest controversy or controversy we have today in the photographic sphere, and that is how to pronounce BOKEH. Bouquet. Now, to prove it, I went to a Japanese pronunciation website, and as you know, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true, and I found the correct pronunciation of bouquet.
Bouquet.
Bouquet. Bow as in bow, as in bow tie, K, K-E-H, as in Kenneth, bouquet. Here's another way to remember it. Bouquet rhymes with okay. Wait, here's yet another way to remember it. Boca is a city in Florida. Bouquet is the quality of blur. Okay, so now that we've learned how to say bouquet, let me show you an image with and without bokeh. So first, BTS, the behind the scenes, the most important part of any photo shoot is how the photo shoot was made, so that you can see exactly all the intricate detail that went in and all the craftsmanship that occurred to produce the very image that you are going to see. This is my kitchen countertop, and those are berries. So this is with everything in focus. And if you look at this picture here, what you can see when you look at it is that everything is in focus. You can see everything. And if this was a seed packet, it would be great. And if this was in the Encyclopedia Britannica, it would be perfect because it would show you exactly everything about everything there is about the berry. So nothing is left to the imagination. And it's really hard to look at because your eye doesn't have any place to rest. It's always moving around because of the way the eye perceives and works. This is with not everything in focus. And what you can see here is that you have an area of attack where the berries are in focus and an area of retreat where the berries are not in focus. And the not in focus part of the picture is actually where the pretty of this picture lives. It's the part that you can fall into. It's the part that is engaging, and it's the part that is the prettiest. We can see the fruit because that's what we want to see. We can see the berries because we want to see them, and then we can rest moving into the berries themselves, the bouquet, the blur. The poetry of this picture is found in the blur. Before we go any further, we need to come to an understanding about stuff. Really couldn't come up with a more pithier way to say this, so stuff it is. All lenses focus. That's what they do. That's their job. But it's the way in which a lens handles from in focus to in blur that is actually the more important consideration. How do I put this? Okay, it's important to have things in your photograph in focus. It's almost mission critical, to be honest. You want things in the image of focus because you want your eye to grab onto it. But having everything in focus is a wee bit overrated. You don't want everything in the photograph to be in focus. You want the thing that you want to grab you to be in focus, and you want to have an area of retreat where your eye can go, which is the blur of the photograph. In every one of my photographs, if I had to pick the one great discovery of my work, it comes down to the beauty of the image is always found in the area as it travels from in focus to in blur. That is singularly the most important part of the photograph, the blur. It's how we handle blur, it's how we control blur. It's the most important thing that we need to consider that frequently we fail to look at because we're so wrapped up in the image being in focus. I invite you to consider in blur. And the body of our conversation is going to be pretty much about that. That having a little touch of softness is great when you have that grip of focus and contrast to pull you. So let's come to an understanding about artsy navel-gazing stuff, which is important in the philosophy of what it is that we're going to do. Every decision that you make about your image, every one of them has to happen at point of capture. Everything. So the more you understand about the middle, how it all works, from how lenses work, how sensors work, how light interacts, how it moves through space, how to connect with people, post-processing all the way to the print, every aspect of that matters. It all matters. And it's all in service of the print. Everything that you're doing is in service in the final image. And what the final image is in service of is your voice, which happens at point of capture. So everything you're doing is in service of the print is in service of your voice, which happens at the moment in which you hit the shutter. You're traveling a circle, but you're doing it in a straight line. Another important thing to keep in mind, every artist has an instrument. Musicians have the instruments that they play. Dancers have the bodies that they use to defy space and gravity that they fly through. Painters have brushes and canvases. Sculptors have rocks and chisel to what they sculpt with, or the clay that they mold. Photographers have a camera. The lens is the brush. The camera sensor is the canvas. The file is the sheet music, and the print is the symphony. It's time to start to get a little bit more technical. So let us come to an understanding about some seriously technical stuff. We need to come up with some operational definitions of things. First, definition of a lens, simply put, is a transparent optical device used to converge or diverge transmitted light and to form images. That's all a lens is. Definition of refraction. Refraction is the change in the direction of light when it passes from one medium to another. So when light comes through a lens, it does a couple of things, one of which is it slightly slows down and it changes its direction. Diffraction. Diffraction is really what does you in. Diffraction is an optical effect which limits the total resolution of your photography. It doesn't matter how big a sensor you have, how many megapixels you've got. Diffraction is what does you in. And what diffraction is it's when light goes through a small opening, it disperses. So the more you stop a lens down, doesn't mean you get it sharper, it means that you extend the area in which things are perceived to be in focus, but the edges themselves will be stopped, or be soft, which brings us to critical aperture. The relative aperture at which an optical system delivers the best balance between aberration correction, contrast rendition, and offers the most even distribution of light across the optical system. It is time now to F the ineffable. to try and describe in words something that we can see, know, and look at, but not necessarily articulate. So let's begin with a basic description of what it is that we're trying to do. Precision versus accuracy. Precision doesn't necessarily mean accuracy. All precision means is how many decimal points something goes back. What accuracy is how well precision reflects itself in reality. For example, you can have a page of great numbers talking about a lens, but those great numbers do not necessarily reflect what beauty is, because what bokeh is the harmonic. Now, poetry in the world of art is the language of heightened emotion. And physics, well, physics is the poetry of science. And optics is one of the poetic forms of physics. And light is the vocabulary in which is used to express that poetry. And photography, well, photography is how that poetry is written. And bokeh is how that poetry is felt. So these are some of the things that affect lens bokeh. The number of blades, number of configuration, length of barrel, there's a whole litany of things, and this is just a handful of them. It's a bunch of stuff that comes together to create something pretty that we don't know until it's created. So let's take a look at what, in this simplified graphic, is good, neutral, and bad bokeh. Good bokeh is where the blur is completely undefined, that it just fades into a lovely blur and you can't pick an edge for it. Neutral bokeh is where the blur circle is even and the edges are retained definition. Even though the circle on the outside is blurred, the center of it is in focus. And that's the way most lenses are designed. And bad bokeh, well, bad bokeh is a blur circle edge is overly defined. It comes back in on itself. It's not something you would wish on anybody, even politicians you don't like. Let's look at bokeh by the numbers quickly. For my favorite lens, the 105 f1.4, this is at 1.4, 1.8, 2.8, 4.5, 5.6, which is critical aperture for this lens, 7.1, 8.0, and f16. And what you should notice when we look at it close up is 1.4, beautiful, beautiful blur, still pretty blur, more defined but pretty blur, more defined, and you can see that I need to clean my lens at this point. f5.6, critical aperture, where we can tell that it is a 9-sided diaphragm. And from this point on, even though the circle of confusion is being increased, or the depth of field is increasing, what's happening is because of diffraction, the thing that always does you in, is that we're going to wind up with not as hard an edge as we could get, but we're going to have an area where there are more things that are of equal values of acceptable out of focus. All right, so which looks better? f16, anatomically correct, which you can tell that I've crammed Christmas lights into a toaster in my kitchen with a Christmas ornament on top of a cookbook that's on top of my cat's scratcher. Or this, which has got pretty bokeh. All right, basic rule of thumb comes down to this. If the lens's maximum aperture is 2.8 and below, critical aperture is at 5.6. If the lens is f2.8 and above, critical aperture falls somewhere between f8 and f11. In other words, perfect numbers do not make beautiful lenses. Bokeh is a harmonic, it's a chord of balance, like a Caesar salad dressing is a chord of balance. A lot of very strong flavors mixed together to create a mild flavor. For a lens designer, it's about mixing the things about a lens that needs to be corrected in such a way that creates a lens that a photographer wants to use to create with. In other words, bokeh is an optical umami. Now we're at the second part of coming to terms with technical stuff. And this part is, what is depth of field and why should I care? You can't talk about blur and bokeh without understanding how depth of field works. So let's do a quick 2-minute discussion about how lenses focus. First, you have to understand what a circle of confusion is. The best definition of a circle of confusion that I have ever heard is Michael Reichmann's, which is simply this. A circle of confusion is defined as a bunch of photographers sitting around a table talking about depth of field. So let me try and bring some clarity to the circle of confusion. In a very simplified explanation, this is how lenses work. You have convex or concave lenses. The front of a lens is convex. So light comes through, refraction occurs, and it does two things. Slows down a little bit while it goes through the glass, and then changes direction and proceeds to get smaller. As the cone of light, which is a three-dimensional experience focuses onto the sensor plane. That is called the point of convergence. That sensor plane or film plane is the focal plane. That dot is the focal point. If you rack the lens forward, you will push the lens past the point of convergence and the circle will get bigger. When you pull back, what will occur is you will hit the point of divergence and go past that, and the circle will get bigger again. So it goes bigger this way, bigger that way. When it's that dot is smack dab on that focus plane, it's in focus. We perceive it as focus. Now there's an area at which it's not quite in focus, but we think that it is in focus, and that is the circle of confusion. You stop the lens down, you make the aperture smaller. You open up the lens, you make the aperture bigger. You either expand the circle of confusion or contract the circle of confusion, and you get an optical illusion of focus. This is a 2D simplified diagram of that experience. The center one's in focus, the top one's convergence, the bottom one is divergence. So now let's come to an understanding of more serious stuff, part 3. You can't have focus without depth of field. And you can't have blur without focus, or at least blur that you can use. So what are the elements that affect depth of field? First, it's the distance of the focus point, subject, to the focal plane, the camera sensor that passes through the lens, and all the magic that occurs in the lens happens to land the light smack dab onto the center plane all at once. Everything the way you want it to be. Aperture. Aperture is mission critical with regards to bokeh and with regards to focus. You close the lens down, you increase the circle of confusion. By stopping it down, you increase the area of acceptable out of focus. There is a point of no return where you get more things that are in that circle of confusion, but they're not necessarily as sharp as they can be. That's called critical aperture. So the narrower the aperture, the greater the depth of field. The more open the lens is, the shallower the depth of field. And then the circle of confusion is compressed. And then, of course, focal length. Wide-angle lenses have a greater depth of field than telephoto lenses, and telephoto lenses have a shallower depth of field. That is the current considered belief by many. Now, of these 3 variables, one of them isn't true. Is it distance of the subject from the focal plane? Is it aperture? Or is it focal length? It's focal length. All lenses have the same depth of field. So, the actual third variable is? And the actual third variable is angle of view. Wide-angle lenses appear to have a greater depth of field because the objects in the image are smaller. The edges of in-focus objects are smaller and more defined. The edges of out-of-focus objects are less defined and they're larger. So if you're in a wide-angle lens, all of the objects are smaller and it's an optical illusion that they're in focus. It's like a 35mm contact sheet. When you would look at a 35mm contact sheet, everything looked like it was in focus, and it wasn't until you put it in the enlarger that all heck went loose and you got blurry images. So let's look at angle of view. So if the camera is focused on exactly the same point, as the lens gets narrower, if the aperture is the same, the depth of field will remain the same, but the angle of view will constrict and things will appear to be shallower. So this is a 35mm shot, this is a 70mm shot, and this is a 135mm shot. Nothing changed. The distance of the subject from the camera is the same, so that means that the distance from the subject to the sensor plane is the same. So let's look at 35, 70, and 135 all blown up to match. And if you look at this, the depth of fields are all the same. So let's look at a comparison. 35 to 135, 70 to 135, and 135 to 135. It doesn't change. All lenses have the same depth of field. Case in point, the next picture we're going to look at. This is 150 about thereabouts images shot at f1.4, and then 50 images shot at f5.6 critical aperture, and then through software magic, it was all assembled. So, we get this pretty image, which I have critical aperture for things that I want critical aperture on, and then I can move into the blur and I can have the bokeh of what I want in blur. So I can have an area of attack and an area of retreat the way in which I want it. Are you confused yet? No? Okay, I'll go on. Fun fact, if you're using a fixed lens system, the physics is really clear on this point. The only thing that can be in focus is that which the lens is physically focused upon, and anything that crosses the plane of focus. And what that means, and this is a cutaway of it so you can see all the elements inside, what that means is we've been taught to pay attention to in focus, about getting everything in focus work. Focus, 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 focus. But the reality of it is that focus is about 1% of your image. What we really should be focusing on and paying attention to is in blur, 99% of your images, because all lenses focus, that's what they do. But it's how a lens handles from in focus to blur that is the more important consideration, or bokeh. So, what that means is this. If you want 4 things in your photograph to be in focus, you have to take 4 photographs and combine them, because depth of field doesn't work that way. Focus doesn't work that way. Let's take a look at that. Focus point 1. Focus point 2. I collect Matchbox cars. Focus point 3. Notice that the 2 cars here are both in focus because they're both on the same plane of focus, and focus point 4 back on the ruler. When I combine all 4 of them together, what I get is an image in which all the objects are in focus. And I also have some of the bokeh that I want. Are you confused yet? Not yet? Okay. I'll keep on going. So, as I mentioned previously, what we do is we create optical illusions. And to put it the way Pablo Picasso put it, art is the lie that tells the truth. So let's look at optical illusions. Of the next 3 images, which gray is darker, which gray is lighter, and is the gray a gradient? So, see this one? This one. Is this gray darker or lighter than that gray? Now, watch this. Is the center bar gray a gradient, or is it the same gray? The gray never changed. They're all the same gray. What we did was we created an optical illusion based on the way in which we perceive. Let's do this again. Which is darker, which is lighter, the top or the bottom? Of this image, which is darker, the top or the bottom? How about now? They're the same. Another optical illusion. By how we handle shade, by how we handle light, by how we approach the image, we can create optical illusions that are visually appealing to the eye. It is your job as the content creator of your image to control where the viewer's eye goes. Focus and blur are very important elements in that control of the eye. You need an area of attack, the point of focus, and you need an area of retreat where the eye can rest, the point of blur, the area of blur. Keeping in mind that what we should be paying attention to is in blur a bit more than in focus, because all lenses focus. That's what they do. So let's observe some of the things that we've just discussed. First observation. We don't really create photographs. What we create are optical illusions. We control where the eye goes by the use of in focus and in blur. Second observation. Though very important, having everything in focus is a bit overrated. The beauty of an image is more often found in the bokeh of the image, the poetry of the blur. Third observation. Stopping a lens down does not get you a sharper image. It only increases the area of acceptable out of focus. Fourth observation. There's a point of diminishing return with regard to stopping a lens down. Once you pass critical aperture, diffraction comes into play. So even though you increase the circle of confusion, the objects will not be as defined as they were at critical aperture. Fifth observation. There is a fine line between cliché, trite, and fine art. Sixth observation. Every decision that you make about your photograph has to happen at point of capture. The more you understand about the middle, the more informed your decisions can be at the moment of capture, because everything you do is in service of the end, the final image. And the end, the final image, is in service of your voice, which happens at the beginning. So you're traveling a circle, but you're doing it in a straight line. Seventh observation. Camera bodies come and go. Technology increases, it gets better. But lenses, the glass, that's eternal. So make your lens choices good ones. Final observation, a well-executed photograph is magic. Are you confused yet? Yes? Feeling that the questions that you've asked have only created answers that make you feel more confused, and you're still as confused as ever, but at least you're confused on a higher level. If that's true, then welcome to the photographer's circle of confusion, and feel the bouquet. And now for some bouquet zen.